Michelle Yates here. Thank you so much for watching my talk. This talk, as well as the larger project that this talk is embedded in, examines the kinds of ideologies and ways of seeing the world that are embedded in the way climate fiction, namely popular Hollywood climate fiction film, produces and reflects American culture. In particular, in this talk, I'm going to focus on the relatively recent 2014 intergalactic sci-fi thriller Interstellar. I plan to show how Interstellar produces and reproduces particular hegemonic notions of race and gender, notions that are intimately linked to the environmental dimensions of the film. One of the key ideas I look at in my research is the way that ecological crisis and climate change are used as recuperative strategies for the reprivileging of hegemonic white masculinity in the 21st century. And we see this in a film like Interstellar. The discourse is embedded in Interstellar. The way environmentalism is articulated to hegemonic white masculinity is also reflected in other 21st century popular Hollywood climate fiction films like The Day After Tomorrow, WALL-E, and even a documentary like An Inconvenient Truth. This project is influenced by feminist ecology, which traditionally looks at and critiques the way women and nature are linked within capitalist patriarchy. Ecofeminist scholars like Stacey Alimo, Mary Malloy, Kate Soper, among others, point out that Western culture has long framed nature in feminine terms, while women are framed as somehow closer to nature, as the embodiment of nature. By contrast, men, white men in particular, are framed as closer to culture, as the embodiment of civilization. As Gail Biederman argues, since the late 19th century, a hegemonic notion of white masculinity has been predicated upon a discourse of civilization. White men have been represented as the most civilized, thereby deserving of social power and privilege. Furthermore, Carolyn Merchant points out that the civilizing process has historically been predicated upon what she calls an Edenic recovery narrative, a narrative predicated upon environmental conservation, specifically the recovery of pristine Edenic nature. In these narratives, white men are often positioned as the heroic agents, as conquerors, explorers, and military men, that tame wild nature, that function to turn wilderness into pristine Edenic nature, nature that is controllable and can presumably be used for capitalist resource extraction and the material basis for commodity production. In the Edenic recovery narrative, the ability to conquer nature is a mark of American masculinity and an important part of the way men embody civilization. Thus, nature is often used, to borrow from Noel Sturgeon, as a tool of power, legitimating social hierarchies and reproducing a dichotomy in which men, culture, agency, and human subjectivity are aligned on the one hand, and women and nature are aligned on the other hand. Women and nature become the ground, the object upon which male-driven culture acts. The latter comes to be seen as dominant, the former as subordinate. We see these gender and race dynamics play out in Interstellar. In Interstellar, a team of explorers, including Cooper, played by Matthew McConaughey, leave Earth to seek a new planet for humans to inhabit. Due to blight affecting the world's food supply, Earth has become an uninhabitable dust bowl, where human survivability is quickly coming to an end. In the film, Cooper functions as the heroic male agent, the explorer figure tasked with saving humanity from environmental destruction by recovering some semblance of pristine Edenic nature. Edenic nature in the film takes the form of interplanetary colonization, discovering a new world for human habitation, as supposedly happens by the end of the film. The race and gender dynamics in Interstellar also reflect the rise of a new form of white masculine identity politics, what Hamilton Carroll calls the white male injury discourse, and Michael Kimmel calls aggrieved entitlement. Kimmel writes that American white men have traditionally for a few centuries, in fact, either been privileged or at least thought of themselves as entitled to privilege. But as Kimmel writes, we are living in, quote, the end of the era of men's entitlement, the era in which a young man could assume without question it was not only a man's world, but a straight white man's world, end quote. According to Kimmel, many white men feel angry as a result of the end of the era of men's entitlement. This anger leads to a grieved entitlement, a sense that white men believe themselves entitled to benefits which seemingly no longer exist. Thus nostalgia, the desire to return to an imagined past, and as Kimmel writes, quote, restore what they once had, end quote, is an incredibly important part of aggrieved entitlement. We see this sense of aggrieved entitlement in a scene early in Interstellar. Cooper is sitting on the front porch having a beer with his father-in-law, played by John Lithgow. And Cooper says, quote, it's like we've forgotten who we are, explorers, pioneers, not caretakers, end quote. Cooper is an educated white man, an engineer, a former pilot, who in a world where nature used to exist, or in our world outside the social world of the film, would hold social power and privilege. In the world of Interstellar, however, Cooper is reduced to living in barren, dusty, dilapidated conditions, and he believes he is entitled to more. Such is the basis for Interstellar's main narrative, leaving Earth to seek a new planet for humans to inhabit. And so ecological crisis becomes an opportunity to circle back to the frontier thesis, to reinvigorate manifest destiny, conquer a new wilderness, and with it, renewed opportunity for reinvestment in white masculine privilege. As I said earlier, the ability to explore, conquer, and control nature has historically been constructed as a mark of American masculinity, and an important part of the way white men embody civilization. Thus, in Interstellar, recovering Edenic nature, albeit on a new planet, is not only about environmental conservation, but also about restoring the social value of white masculinity. This is what we see at the end of Interstellar, the restoration of the social value of white masculinity alongside the reclamation of Edenic nature. And I get it. There's supposedly a twist at the end of the film. It turns out that it's really the daughter, Murph, that saves humanity at the end of the film. But we don't actually see this in the film. The film is fundamentally about Matthew McConaughey's character Cooper and his exploration as a heroic male agent. We are only told at the end of the film that the daughter is the actual savior, that the space station Cooper is named after her, Murph, and not Cooper. Supposedly the idea is that white women can be heroic agents too. But if that's true, why is the whole film about the journey of a heroic male agent? And by the end of the film, Murph, the daughter, is super old. She's sick. She's dying. By contrast, Cooper is seemingly forever young, virile, and masculine. In restoring Edenic nature, by finding a new planet for humans to inhabit, he has restored the seemingly infinite social virility of white masculinity. Critical reviews of Interstellar cite it as an example of a recent popular trope in Hollywood film, that of space colonization or leaving Earth to escape ecological crisis and planetary collapse. We see this trope in other Hollywood films, including WALL-E and Elysium, as well as in popular television shows like Firefly and its film continuation Serenity, and the Netflix revival of Lost in Space. But this trope in Interstellar, as it is in some of these other films, is not just simply a fantasy of flight from Earth. It is more specifically a white flight from planet Earth fantasy. The main narrative thrust of Interstellar is leaving Earth to seek a new planet for white people to inhabit, and as such has important historical context as well as social and material consequences. Thus, what we see at the end of Interstellar is that people, white people, have returned to civilization on board the space station Cooper, orbiting Saturn as they wait for their new planet to be turned into a pristine Garden of Eden. In this respect, Interstellar very much promotes a message regarding white flight from planet Earth. Furthermore, as the blog site Hail to You points out, the use of the term blight in Interstellar to describe the cause of environmental devastation on Earth very much has racialized overtones, mirroring a discourse of urban decay used to justify both white flight from the city in the post-World War II era, as well as gentrification and the displacing of lower-income residents and residents of color from certain city neighborhoods in the contemporary moment. In this way, Interstellar implicitly blames people of color for ecological destruction and economic decline. The film also posits civilization in the form of a reunion of the white nuclear family. The reunion of father and daughter in the presence of many later generations of Coopers, and the return of the masculine father figure, Cooper, who functions as the heroic male agent to save this family. So there's this theme throughout Interstellar of saving future generations, of seeking a home elsewhere in which to save one's kids. And this is a discourse that strongly mirrors the discourses used by middle-class white families, justifying white flight from the city in the post-World War II era. And of course, the space station Cooper looks just like white suburbia, replete with white kids playing baseball. And what we see here is that this kid hits the baseball and the camera pans following the baseball. And so we see this 360-degree space station Cooper. So we're seeing the white suburbia on the space station upside down. In this respect, Interstellar represents a troubling contemporary phenomena that Andrew Zass dubs inverted quarantine. According to Zass, traditional quarantine assumes that the environment is healthy overall. Thus, it involves isolating discrete sources of risk to the otherwise healthy environment, for example, a diseased individual. However, when overall environmental conditions are no longer healthy, but rather contain risk, such as pollution and toxins that cannot be so easily isolated, as in the case of our current historical moment, that dyadic relationship of healthy overall environment and diseased individual becomes inverted. Individuals then feel that the only way they can protect themselves from the toxic environment is, as Zass writes, quote, by isolating themselves from their disease-inducing surroundings, by erecting some sort of barrier or enclosure and withdrawing behind it or inside of it, end quote. Zass documents the way that Americans in the 21st century attempt to isolate themselves from environmental toxins by investing in a personal commodity bubble through the purchase of bottled water, organic food, and other so-called green or natural household products. In other words, inverted quarantine is an individualist, consumerist way of protecting oneself against environmental degradation. Zass shows that contemporary inverted quarantine has a social history rooted in suburbanization and white flight from the city in the post-World War II era. Encouraged by racist and exclusionary policies promoted by government-sponsored agencies like the Federal Housing Administration and the Homeowners Loan Corporation, white people moved out of cities to the suburbs in droves in the post-World War II era. The idea was to get away from, to isolate themselves from, the supposed social threats of the city. These social threats included fear of crime, often code for fear of non-white racial others. And white flight from the city created dire social and material consequences. As Steve Masick writes, one of the consequences of white flight from the city in the mid to late 20th century is the decline of the economic health of major U.S. cities, and by extension, the creation of a number of urban problems with which inner-city communities, extensively communities of color, have been saddled. These issues include higher rates of unemployment, poverty, and crime, as well as a higher burden of environmental pollution than their suburban, often white counterparts. And while white flight is at the root of causing the poor conditions of inner-city black and brown neighborhoods, as Masick further writes, it is largely white suburban perceptions of the inner city that dominates the public discourse around these neighborhoods. These are largely conservative discourses that function to blame communities of color for the impoverished conditions of their neighborhoods. And we see this blaming in Interstellar via the naming of blight for the cause of environmental devastation. Laura Polito shows that urbanization not only allowed white folks to move away from non-white residents, but also the traditional industrial urban core with its associated environmental pollution. Suburbanization functioned to secure white residents' access to cleaner environments. In another scene early in the film, Cooper is talking with Professor Brand, played by Michael Caine, in the covert NASA facility he has just discovered. Cooper asks Professor Brand what NASA's plan is for saving the world. Professor Brand's response is, quote, "We're not meant to save the world, we're meant to leave it," end quote. By we, Interstellar implicitly means middle-class white people. Middle-class white people are not meant to do the work to change a system that is causing significant environmental harm to the planet. Harm that is often disproportionately experienced by communities of color, but increasingly is being experienced by white communities as well. By we, Interstellar implies that middle-class white people are not meant to give up the race and class privilege that is manifested in significant material benefits. Rather, middle-class white people are meant to leave the planet in the way that their antecedents left American cities in the post-World War II era. Yet as Deepesh Chakrabarty notes in his essay, The Climate of History, quote, "There are no lifeboats here for the rich and privileged," end quote. The environmental and material protections afforded white folks by fleeing cities in the post-World War II era will not translate to space colonization and white flight from planet Earth. And this in spite of multiple government agencies and corporations like NASA, Elon Musk's SpaceX, and Mars One sinking billions of dollars into research promoting human settlement on Mars. The near future for middle-class white people probably more likely resembles the world depicted in the 1973 sci-fi cult classic Soylent Green than the return to the post-World War II suburban utopia depicted at the end of Interstellar. As Andrew Zass argues, inverted quarantine often offers an imaginary refuge from environmental pollution. Most commodity products do not successfully protect people from environmental pollution. Yet, as Zass further points out, the danger of investing in inverted quarantine as a solution to climate change and ecological crisis is a refusal to invest in the kinds of collective responses that might actually be an effective solution. Zass discusses the kinds of collective strategies utilized by the 1970s environmental movement, which pushed the United States government toward greater regulation of environmental resources, such as the 1970 Clean Air and Clean Water Acts. Unfortunately, suburbanization and the popularity of the inverted quarantine mentality has shifted American politics at the national scale toward conservatism, marked by privatization and budget cuts to social programs, as well as skepticism toward the existence of climate change. And unfortunately, the suburbs in the United States have a significant amount of political voting power. So we see how a film like Interstellar, which may seem progressive on the surface, reinforces this political conservatism by addressing the environment through individualist and consumerist means. So it becomes important to address how we can begin to visualize an ecology that does not perpetuate existing power structures like patriarchal white supremacy, that is articulated to the capitalist mode of production at the root of causing ecological crisis in the first place. As Carolyn Merchant asks, how can we begin to visualize a post-patriarchal, socially just ecotopia? Or as Andrew Hageman puts it, how can we begin to visualize an ecology without capital?